When the world becomes too loud, there comes a moment in every woman's life when the noise around her becomes too much, not because the volume truly increases, but because her mind begins to realize it has been listening for far too long. Opinions, stares, unsolicited advice. Everyone seems to have something to say about her, about how she should live, how she should speak, how she should feel. She never asked, yet they answered. And sometimes, out of politeness, out of habit, out of fear of disappointing, she listens. She listens for so long that she forgets the sound of her own voice. She reacts, she explains, she tries to become the most agreeable version of herself, not because she is weak, but because she believes it's necessary to keep peace, to do what's right, to be loved. But the more she reacts, the more exhausted she becomes. The more she tries to understand others, the more misunderstood she feels. When she shares her feelings, they call her too sensitive. When she remains silent, they call her distant. In their eyes, she has never been enough. And the danger is not in what they think. It's in the moment she begins to believe they're right. She doubts her emotions. She questions her choices. She tries to fix things that were never broken to begin with. Every criticism becomes a splinter in her self-worth. And slowly, piece by piece, she drifts away from herself. No one notices. Because on the outside she still smiles, still stands strong, still carries the weight. But inside is a quiet storm, a sigh no one hears. Each time she speaks up to defend herself, does anyone truly listen? Or are they just waiting for her to stop so they can continue pressing their views? Each time she asks to rest, does anyone ask if she's tired? Or do they assume she's just avoiding something? Her patience is mistaken for passivity. Her tolerance is mistaken for weakness. And she begins to feel trapped in a role she once tried so hard to fulfill. The world does not stop speaking, and the more it speaks, the more she feels a stranger to herself. Every piece of advice that doesn't fit becomes noise. Every judgmental glance becomes pressure. And that noise, it doesn't come from the outside anymore. It echoes in her mind over and over, silent questions. Am I good enough? Should I be different? What did I do wrong? Questions no one answers. Questions that drown out the sound of her own heart. But what matters is this. She begins to realize that the noise is not hers. It comes from expectations, from bias, from people who have never lived a single day in her body. And that realization wakes her up, not with a loud revelation, but with a quiet, clear awareness. She doesn't have to live in the noise forever. She doesn't have to keep trying to become someone just to be accepted. She only has to begin listening to herself again. And in that moment, though silent, she begins to change. Not with grand gestures, not with declarations, but with stillness. To listen, not to others, but to herself. That is the first step in returning. Returning to herself. Returning to the peace she lost in the noise of the world. The quiet transformation. Change in a woman's life doesn't always begin with a sound. Often, it begins with exhaustion. Not the kind of tiredness that disappears after a good night's sleep, but the kind that settles deep within. A quiet knowing that she has given too much, tried too long, compromised too deeply. And though she can still smile, still work, still care for everyone around her, somewhere inside, something has begun to crack. Transformation is never loud. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need applause. It happens when she sits alone in a quiet room, when she looks in the mirror and asks, is this really me? When she rereads old conversations and wonders, why did I explain myself that much? When she walks away from a conversation feeling unsettled and thinks, I've forgotten something important, the respect I owe myself. Not everyone recognizes that moment. But for her, that's when everything begins to shift. Not because someone hurt her more, but because she no longer wants to keep hurting herself. She no longer wants to stay in relationships where kindness must be begged for. She no longer wants to nod along with things that violate her values. She no longer wants to play the agreeable role just to preserve a false peace. She doesn't change by resisting, not through anger, not through complaints, but through withdrawal. She steps back from conversations that offer nothing but fatigue. She steps away from spaces where her presence isn't valued. She steps back not because she lost, but because she finally understood. Understood that no one deserves the fullness of her energy if they don't know how to honor it. Think of a woman who once gave her youth trying to please her family. She studied what they chose, married who they approved, lived the life they thought was right. She tucked away her emotions to keep everything smooth. She did it all, hoping to be seen. But one day, while folding her child's clothes, she broke down in tears. Not because of the child, not because of anyone, but because in that moment she realized she couldn't remember the last time she did something just for herself. And so, she begins to change. She doesn't walk away, she doesn't abandon, but she starts asking simple questions. What do I like? How do I want to live? Do I still believe in the things I'm doing? She starts with small changes, taking a morning walk alone, turning off her phone during dinner, saying no to invitations that don't feel right. And with each small act, she begins to reclaim parts of herself she had forgotten. Quiet transformation doesn't require immediate bravery. It only asks for one decision, the decision not to keep living the same way, the decision to stop entering spaces where her presence goes unseen, the decision to pause and ask what she truly needs. Because sometimes what she needs isn't advice, isn't permission. It's just a quiet space to breathe. She doesn't need to raise her voice to be heard. She only needs to be silent long enough to hear herself again. When she pauses, things don't suddenly become easy, but they become clearer. She starts to see who really listens when she's no longer trying to be understood. She begins to recognize who shows up for her and who only comes for what she can offer. And when she pulls back her energy from the wrong places, she begins to rebuild herself from the ground up. No one needs to know she has changed, but they will feel it. In the way she speaks less, but with more clarity. In the way she no longer forces a smile. In the way she declines with grace, but without hesitation. In the way she moves unrushed, unshaken, and without needing validation. True transformation always happens in silence. There are no fireworks, no stage. Only a woman quietly pulling her gaze away from the world, so she can finally, after a very long time, look at herself again. And that is the moment she begins to become her truest self. Not for anyone else to see, but so that she no longer abandons herself. The power of silence. When a woman chooses silence, the world often misunderstands. They assume she's weak, that she's avoiding, that she doesn't know how to stand up for herself. But the truth is the opposite. Because silence, when it comes from awareness, is the first sign of inner strength. It needs no proof. It needs no explanation. It only requires one thing: clarity from within. Silence is not surrender. It is the refusal to give energy to things no longer worthy. It is an affirmation without words, a boundary without needing to be drawn, a deliberate choice about what to keep and what to let go. A mature woman does not respond to everything, not because she can't, but because she understands that not everything deserves her peace. Think of a woman who once argued with everyone. Every judgment she responded to. Every misunderstanding she tried to explain. She always kept the peace, even at the cost of her own feelings. But the more she reacted, the more empty she felt. One day, after yet another exhausting argument that resolved nothing, she walked out of the room and realized silence might be the only answer she had left. From that day on, she changed. Not because she stopped caring, but because she started caring more about herself. She began to choose what deserved her time and attention. Negative comments no longer got replies. Doubtful glances no longer needed explanation. She wasn't cold. She had simply learned that respect should never have to be begged for. The power of silence isn't in saying nothing. It's in knowing when to speak and when to hold back. A silent woman isn't one without words. She has plenty, but she saves them for those who truly listen. In that quiet, she becomes sharper. She no longer needs to win every conversation, because she knows that if something needs too much explaining, maybe it's not worth holding on to. Silence is also how she takes ownership of her emotions. Before, she would react quickly when misunderstood. But over time, she realized those who choose not to understand will never hear, no matter how much she speaks. So she stops. She doesn't respond to be right. She doesn't argue to be heard. She lets the truth speak through time, through action, through the calm she holds within. That calm doesn't come from magic. It comes from practice. Every time she chooses silence over reaction, she's strengthening her inner power. Every time she withdraws instead of fighting, she's declaring her worth. Every time she walks away from a hurtful conversation without throwing back pain, she is choosing herself. Not everyone will understand, but she no longer needs everyone to. She only needs herself to know what makes her stronger. Silence doesn't make her small. It makes her steady. No one can shake a woman who has learned to control her reactions. Not because she no longer feels, but because she's learned to place her emotions where they belong. In every pause, she is not weakening. She is gathering. She is healing. She is preparing for a clearer version of herself. If you've ever been silent not because you had nothing to say, but because you knew what was worth holding on to and what needed to be let go, you'll understand this feeling. If you've ever stepped back not because you lost, but because you chose peace within, you'll see yourself in these words. Share your thoughts if you've been through moments like these. Maybe you're still in the middle of your journey, or maybe you've walked through it already. Every story you tell will help another woman feel less alone. And if you know someone who needs to read this, send it to them. Because sometimes, the only thing someone needs to begin changing is knowing they are not alone. Maturing in stillness. No one truly sees growth until it has already happened, because that process is never loud. It doesn't begin with grand milestones or public declarations. It begins in silence. A woman stops answering phone calls that only drain her. She starts saying no to gatherings she once forced herself to attend. Not because she no longer cares about others, but because she begins to genuinely care for herself. Maturity doesn't arrive with age. It comes when she stops doing what others expect and starts living according to what she truly needs. When she sits alone and no longer feels lonely. When she stops chasing validation from the outside and begins building value from within. When she accepts that no one will fully understand her, and instead of feeling isolated, she feels free. There was a woman who once carried everything. Family, work, relationships. She was always the peacemaker. Always the one who absorbed the burden to keep things calm. But one morning she woke up feeling empty, even though everything outside still seemed to function. She went to work, she cared for her children, she smiled. But inside, she felt like she was disappearing. And in that quiet moment, she understood that if she didn't pause, she would vanish from her own life. So she began to walk every morning. No phone, no podcast, no news, just the sound of footsteps and breathing. Each morning, she allowed herself to exist without doing anything. And in those mornings, she started to see more clearly what had been lost in the rush. She had forgotten how to care for herself, forgotten how to sit without guilt, forgotten how to enjoy something without feeling selfish. In stillness, she began to observe, not others but herself. She noticed her reactions. Things that once made her angry now brought a quiet smile. People who once caused her pain now only brought lightness, not because they had changed, but because she had. Her maturity didn't make her rigid, it made her selective. She no longer needed to speak so much. Her presence spoke for itself. She learned to love herself not through indulgence, but through boundaries. Not every relationship needs saving. Not every conversation needs a response. Not every invitation needs acceptance. She no longer tried to hold on to those who wanted to leave. If they stayed, it was out of true love. And for that, she was grateful. And this didn't come from coldness. It came from a deep understanding that if she didn't protect her peace, no one else could do it for her. Maturing in stillness didn't make her distant. It brought her closer to herself, to what truly matters. She spent time rereading books she once loved, writing down small daily moments of gratitude, watching trees grow, catching the sunrise, and realizing not all progress can be seen. Some things grow inwardly, quietly, steadily. If you've ever gone through a season where silence helped you heal, if you've ever stepped away from the rush to find yourself again, then you know not every silence is loneliness. Some silences are the soil where the soul finds its roots again. And sometimes, what a person needs isn't more noise or busyness, but enough space to hear what's been forgotten for too long. Where are you on that journey? What have you paused? What have you just begun? Share it if you feel called to, because what you've learned in stillness may be exactly what someone else is searching for. And if you know someone weary from the weight of life, send them this, not to solve everything, but simply to remind them it's okay to stop. It's okay to return. And sometimes, that's exactly where true growth begins, when peace becomes the standard. There's something she realized after everything, that life doesn't need to be lived in a rush. It doesn't need to be filled with noise. It doesn't need someone's approval to be meaningful. Each day, she walks more gently, not because life has become easier, but because her inner world is no longer in chaos. What once kept her up at night no longer stirs her. What once caused panic now only makes her breathe deeply and move forward. Peace, she understands, is not a destination. It's a way of living, a choice made again and again each day, in every small decision, in how she replies to a message, in how she chooses silence over reacting to disrespect, in how she withdraws her energy from places that once drained her. And each time she does, she doesn't grow weaker. She affirms to herself that peace is non-negotiable. There was a time when she lived in constant reaction. When someone said something wrong, she felt the need to correct it. When someone doubted her, she felt the need to prove herself. When someone went silent, she grew anxious and tried to reconnect. But the more she reacted, the more she felt distant from herself. She wasn't living from clarity, but from the responses of the outside world. She wasn't choosing, she was reacting, and it left her exhausted. So she began to ask different questions. Do I really need to respond right now? Do I really need to be understood immediately? Am I holding on to something that no longer fits? And slowly, she started choosing silence. Not the silence of giving up, but the silence of someone who has chosen to guard her inner peace instead of trading it for temporary victories. Imagine a woman working in an environment that demands perfection. Every decision she makes is scrutinized, every minor mistake magnified. She used to work overtime, taking on others' responsibilities just to avoid criticism. She kept smiling even when her heart was tired. But one day, in a meeting where she was blamed for something she didn't do, she simply looked up and said, "I understand. Thank you." And then she stayed silent. No one expected her not to react. No one thought she could remain that calm But in that moment, she knew something inside her had shifted, because her silence didn't come from fear. It came from clarity. The clarity that she no longer needed to strain herself for acceptance. She chose to preserve her energy for things that truly mattered. From that day on, she made peace her standard. She no longer stepped into relationships that cost her self-respect. She no longer agreed to things that went against her values. She no longer showed up out of fear of being forgotten. She only went where she felt seen, not for what she did, but for who she truly was. And the strange thing is, when she started living that way, everything became clearer. Unhealthy relationships quietly fell away. The things that once made her anxious lost their hold. She spent more time with herself, reading not because someone said she should, journaling not to share but to understand herself, walking not to burn calories, but to hear what was stirring inside. When peace becomes your standard, you stop chasing the need to prove anything. You stop reacting just to keep your place in someone's life. You stop needing apologies to forgive. You stop needing reasons to let go. You simply choose whatever brings your soul more peace. And from that place, you begin to live more deeply. Not hurried, not rushed, not afraid of being left behind. If you walk through this chapter, you know there is nothing more valuable than inner peace. And if you're somewhere in the middle of that journey, keep going. Don't let the noise of the world drown out the quiet sound of your own truth. If you see yourself in this story, feel free to share it, not to tell the whole world, but to gently remind someone that sometimes change doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be real and peaceful enough to last.